Good morning. We'll be starting here in about a minute, maybe a minute and a half. It's a bright sunny day. We'll give folks another 30 seconds or so to finish logging in, and then we'll get started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the Cornell Local Roads program, and welcome to our penultimate webinar for this series. I love that word. It sounds like the end, but we've got one more to go after that. So, um, So we're talking today about employee handbooks. Um, was originally going to do this as a panel, but the people that I asked were all busy. So I always have a backup plan. Not a big deal. If you've got an employee handbook by the time we're done that you are proud of and you want to share, please send it our way. We'd love to share it with others because the more ideas we can have, the better off everybody is going to be. So just as a reminder, if you haven't done one of these before, please, check your audio settings on the lower left. Open up the chat pod. That is where Jody will drop in the handout, which is just an outline of the sessions, but some resource links that you might use. May ask you to raise your hand a few times. And if you do have a question for us, you can use the Q&A. That's where you type those questions in, whether it's about the webinar itself, technical issues, or answering some of the questions because you can't access the polls. No big deal. Okay. Now, in terms of foundational webinars, as I said, this is the next to last one. It's on employee handbooks. We'll be doing another one, the last one of this series, in 2 weeks. By then, we'll actually have the listing for the next cycle, and I'll actually talk about that then and also show up in our next newsletter, um, the Road Chatter that comes out in September. So let's do a bit of a welcome and find out who's here and who deals with employees. I can see the numbers, but it's always good to get a little bit of help in this respect. We're going to be using pollev.com/DavidOrPE. And again, if you had opened up the chat pod, there is a link there. So you have to type it in, or you can just type it in. So let's start with, who do you work for? Do you work for a town, a county, a city, a village, state or fed, tribal, MPO, consultant, contractor, or are you, like everybody, you're working for the weekend? Let's see what we got today. Okay. Well, we got some different folks today. Mostly town, about 2/3 of you from towns. Uh, and then the rest are split between city, village, MPO, and state or fed. Okay. And then what is your job? Are you the highway official? Are you an administrator? Are you an engineer, a planner? Are you in the field crew, a supervisor? You're actually an elected board member, um, or you do whatever the boss tells you to do. And if you type in none of the above, I haven't seen any of that yet, but if you do, again, please be sure to put it into the poll. You can always answer via the polls as well. That's just fine. Okay. So again, we got a variety of folks, engineers and board members. Cool. That's actually good to see. Okay, so how long have you been there? Less than a month, less than a year, 1 to 2, 3 to 5, 5 to 10, 11 to 20, or you've been there so long that they've named something after you, or at least they're thinking about it. Okay. Oh, wow, we've got quite a bunch of folks in the 11 to 20 year category. That's interesting. And somebody who's less than a year, brand new. Okay. And then where in the state are you from? And of course, you just get to click on this one. So you can click on the map, tell me where you're from. And we got Albany, Rochester, Watertown. Jamestown, down this Westchester County, it looks like, out in the islands. Okay. Now, I know that's not everybody because I can count the number of people on the webinar and the number of clicks, but that's okay. We'll take what we get. Okay. Okay, so a lot of urban, but we got a couple of rural folks. And again, all of what I'm going to talk about today is applicable no matter what. Now, I'm going to start by saying something which doesn't sound like it's related to an employee handbook. And that's I'm going to start with retaining employees. And you may not think so, but an employee handbook is part of the tools you need in your toolbox to help retain employees. A good employee handbook that you actually follow is a great communication tool and can actually build up the rapport between the people who are managing things and the crew. And you all know that employees are your most valuable resource. Without a good employees, you just can't get things done. We know that here, and we know that as we go around the state and we talk to people, employees are the most valuable. And yet, at times, we put pressure on ourselves and we actually do things that we know are a little counterproductive. But we can help by having a really good employee handbook. Now, when we did a survey of staffing a couple of years ago, we asked, what are the hardest positions to fill? And then we got some data from colleagues at other centers around the country, and they told us similar things. So we broke it all down, and you can see finding skilled people is a challenge. If you think about it, over half of the people in this chart are skilled positions. In fact, over three-quarters. Um, equipment operators, mechanics, uh, water and wastewater people. These are difficult people to fill. That's over half. And then you get to laborers and other positions, which can be challenging because maybe you don't have the salary, or maybe you've got issues with being able to get them. And of course, we got a few folks who say, well, I just can't replace it because we're tight on budgets and things like that. You know who those people are. That employee handbook will actually help you here because if it's clear and organized and followed, people will actually respect that and you'll be more likely to get good candidates. And we know that from talking with towns across the state and counties across the state. Now, one of the challenges with new hires, both getting them and keeping them, of course, comes back to, again, finding that skilled personnel. Okay? Uh, do they have the skills to do things? And we'll talk about how we can overcome that a little bit. Pay rate is a major issue. There's some people say that there's an attitude issue with new employees. And we'll talk about that a little bit in relation, at least to the handbook. And then there was a plethora of other things that people listed as concerns when they're bringing in new hires. Okay? So let's just start before we even get started here, just to help me out. Do you have an employee handbook? Yes, no, you're not sure. You have a contract, and it's part of that contract that you've got either with just your employees or via a union. You have something in addition to the contract, a separate document, or you can type something else. We may have missed choices, but let's just see where we stand. Okay. Okay, so most of you, two-thirds of you, have an employee handbook. So for those of you who do have a handbook, um, raise your hand if you think your handbook is really good. You like your handbook and you feel like maybe just pick up one or two things today versus maybe it's time to look at it from scratch. Raise your hand if you really like your handbook. I'll just get a sense here. Okay. And people, when we've talked to people about what they don't like about their handbook, they tend to be one of two or three things. Primarily, they're missing something. They know there's things we're missing and we need to add, but you want to balance that with not making it too complicated. Others don't like what they've got because it's too complicated. A handbook that's 5,000 pages long or policies doesn't really help if nobody can actually follow it. And then finally, maybe the language is out of date or there's some technical reason why it needs to be updated. Here's the thing, when you put something in writing, make sure you realize that once it's in writing, you have to do that. And don't make promises you can't keep. If you promise people in writing that says we're going to pay for certain personal protective equipment, and then you don't follow through, or that you're going to get a raise if you do certain work or a different position, that's ruining your credibility and people are going to start looking and going other places. And it's not just salary that's going to drive people away. Okay? You'd be amazed what people will take for a salary if they really like what they do. And what's even more valuable is people will come back to a place after they realize, yeah, they don't pay as much, but they treat us really well. So you really need to make sure you keep and don't break any promises that you make. Okay? So, just what you think. I'm going to go through what we think is some good stuff to have in a policy. We're going to walk through one particular policy that we like out of the town of Preble, but we've added a few other items to it. But what do you think should be in an employee handbook? What kind of things? Expectations of the employees. Yeah, that's good. Okay, see what else we got. I'd like to get 6 or 7 things here. Rights. Now, this is the rights of the employees and the rights of management. You really want both in there, and they really should be both sides in a good thing. Things like cell phone use are the kinds of details that you need to have in there. Okay, yeah. How are you going to deal with raises and promotions and stuff like that? Okay. What rights do people have? What rules are followed? Are you civil service or not? Safety issues should be part of that. Now, some people will say, well, I've got a series of policies that we follow instead. Realize a series of policies combined together is an employee handbook, may just not be in a single document, but it really is the same thing. Okay? Attire is one, hours, workplace. There's all kinds of things that should be in there. And my goal today is to give you a whole bunch of thoughts about what makes sense to have in your stuff. And that includes things like vacation, okay, time off, and even pay in some cases. What I like to do to start, before you start developing an employee handbook, think about what your agency does. What are the responsibilities within your department? And build your policies around that, okay? So we do this in several of other of our webinars, but let's just see, what do y'all have as responsibilities? And do this as one word. We're going to build one of those little Wordle things like we just did for the what's in the handbook. What are the responsibilities of your department? And remember who we're serving. We're serving the public. So what are your responsibilities? Do you manage roads? Ah, there we go. Roads, highway safety. Yeah. If you got a water department, you might have a water line. You're going to be building projects. Okay. You're going to be dealing with drainage. Okay. I haven't seen the one that we're going to be talking about. Ah, there it is. Plowing. Yeah. Snow plowing in the winter. Okay. Solid waste and sewers and storm sewers and sanitary sewers, depending where you are. You might have to deal with railroads and traffic, bridges, culverts. You could make a list. And if you think about it, a lot of the policies come back to how do we make it efficient, effective, and fair for everybody to do these duties. If you put something in a policy that doesn't affect you, what you're doing, why is it in there in the first place? Okay. And again, be careful about what you put in writing. Tree control, I see striping. Okay, again, make that list and then look at your policy and see if they match up. Now, if you're with a town or if you're with a county even, I would absolutely advise you to have a copy of the Office of the Town Highway Superintendent from the Association of Towns. It's got lots of forms, it's got legal requirements, it lists a lot of the duties, and even has stuff in there talking about how to deal with employee issues. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. How many of you have a copy of that book that you could access right now? Since about 2/3 of you were with towns or counties, I hope it's 2/3 of you raising your hand. But if you don't, you absolutely should get that. If you're a full member town, you can get an electronic copy. Okay, and you get a copy of it for free. If you're with a county or you're not a member town, like a village or a private entity, you can get that for about, I think it's $10 these days, might be 15. Definitely worthwhile to have, and there's some good information in there, and it can help you as you're trying to build up a policy for your employees. So now, before we get into the actual policy itself, I want to stop for just a second and talk a little bit about hard hats. Okay? Now, here's a good example. I've met this gentleman. This is an example of what a hard hat does for you. He was out trimming brush, the tree snapped, hit the helmet, punched a hole in it, but the helmet did its job. It failed in such a way that it punched a hole in the helmet, but he walked away unharmed. Okay? Versus these engineers, this is taken by a colleague of mine uh, who worked in Oregon, and he shows up on the site and he asks his engineers who worked under him, "Where the heck is your hard hat?" And they actually had the audacity to say, "Well, if one of those big rocks come down, we're going to be dead anyway." Meanwhile, there were pebbles coming down, any one of which could have given somebody as a minimum some, bruise and possibly even a concussion. Okay, so, we know hard hats can help, but again, do you have a policy? So who sets the hard hat policy in your agency? Is it the crew leader? Is it the highway official, the elected board? Is it in your contract? Is this a state law or a federal policy? Now you can select all of these, by the way, if you want. And this is actually one of the more important things to think about when you're developing your employee handbook. Because the answer actually is yes. Everybody on this list has the power to set policy. And everybody higher up on this list can actually set policy that might supersede someone lower on this list. So if there is no policy in an agency, a crew leader can decide what that policy is, and to do so from the standpoint of setting safety issues. The highway official has that right to then say, well, no, we're going to make it everybody has to wear a hard hat all the time, or you don't have to wear a hard hat in certain situations. Elected boards can also go over this unless it's in a contract, and the contract needs to be followed. And of course, you can't supersede state law or federal policy. So as an example, if you're working on a federal aid job, you have to wear a hard hat and have the proper safety vest on that job, or you're in jeopardy of having funds pulled. Okay, so pretty much everybody can set a policy. But here's the thing. Once we put something in writing, we need to understand we need to follow that policy. And how do we make sure people actually do follow the policy? Do we have teeth behind it to enforce it? Okay, and safety is our shining star. We've got a few pictures we've borrowed from others. This comes from Phil Spezio out of Washington County. Yes, it was staged. Just so you know, he staged it. Okay. Obviously, we know what's wrong here. But this is the thing, the point to take home. Policies can be good and they can be bad. Once you put something in your policy, you need to follow it. And if it's a bad policy, you might be following something that is crazy. So as an example, one of the policies we came across had a rule that said you had to wear a hard hat every time you were working. So the minute you started working. So that means you were technically had to wear a hard hat while driving. That's probably actually not a good policy. Okay. Or we've seen purchasing policies where the board had to approve every purchase at a board meeting if it was over $50. That makes it almost impossible to do your job. So a good policy really has to balance things. And once you put it in writing, you do need to follow it. Now we're going to use a policy from the town of Preble. Thank you to Jeff Griswold. That we think is a pretty good one. It balances the complex problems without being super, super long. Okay? We are big fans of it because also it's written in relatively straightforward language. It isn't got a lot of legalese kind of stuff in it. I'm not saying those things aren't important. They are. But if you're writing a policy for working with everybody, it needs to be words you can all understand. If I ask you for some, I want to have a companion animal that's got 4 legs, that's not very clear. If I say I want a cat or a dog, we can understand that. So try to write a good policy and realize it's a living document. It needs to change. If your policy and you look on the cover and it's old, that could be an issue. So those of you who said you had a policy, which is most of you, either be a contract or you have one. How many of you have a date on the front of that contract or that policy that's more than 5 years old? Raise your hand if it's more than 5 years old. If you're not sure, you can not raise your hand, but think about it. If it's more than 5 years old, that means you really haven't looked at it. You probably should review it and update that date. and say it was last checked or last updated. We are part of a national association around the country, and we actually have an organizational operations plan. We are required to review that at least once every 4 years, just so we force ourselves to make sure we've read through it and go, why did we put that in writing? And we take it out if it's not going to help us. Okay? Not to say there aren't things we could call out more, there probably are, but review it on a regular basis. And only a few of you raised your hands. I'm hoping most of you don't know the date, or you have more modern dates, and that's good. Okay? But it's a living document, it needs to change. And remember, keep it simple. Okay? Remember the goal here is to have a plan moving forward. Okay? If you're walking on a trail, you want to give people a nice clear path so they know the right way to go forward. Okay? So keep it simple is a firm thing I want to talk about. Now, so let's go through some of the things that are important. And again, this is in the outline from the handout, and we'll have a little bit of fun as we go. So, full-time versus part-time employees. This obviously needs to be part of your personnel plan. You're going to have different rules because you've got different rules for overtime, you've got different rules for pay, okay? And you're going to have different rules for when people work or don't have to work, okay? So, how many of you have part-time employees? Raise your hand if you've got part-time employees. Okay. Not everybody does. Okay. So not very many of you have part-time employees. We'll come back to seasonal employees in a little bit, but part-time people are going to be treated slightly differently. That's not good or bad, it just is. So do you have an agreement with your employees? Do you actually have you can have a yes, a no, an informal one in writing, or you have a negotiated contract. So you can click on one of these and tell me what you've got. Okay. Okay, so of the people who clicked in, 60% of you have a negotiated contract, most likely with a union. Okay, doesn't have to be, by the way, in New York State. 20% of you have a written agreement. That can be very useful to have something in writing so everybody's on the same page. But again, remember, once you put it in writing, you do need to follow it. And if you don't have an agreement, think about the situations when a conflict occurs. How do you deal with that conflict? And that's where an employee handbook can be extremely valuable because it becomes almost like your agreement. Now, if you have an agreement, whether it's negotiated or not, you probably should tie your employee handbook to it, and you may need to in the case of a negotiated contract. There may be something you have to negotiate with a couple of exceptions, and I'll mention those exceptions as we go through that are not part of negotiations. And once they get put in writing, can actually create some headaches because there are a few times when we know it's actually happened, and I'll cover those when we get to them. So part of what should be in your employee handbook, part of what should be in your negotiated contract, are your working hours. When do people actually have to work? And we want to have flexibility when we can, but we have to get the job done, which is why I go all the way back to that idea of what are your responsibilities. Here at the LTAP Center here in Ithaca, we typically don't have to worry too much about plowing snow. Okay, we aren't out plowing snow. So our working hours can be a little more flexible because of that. Okay, but if you're out plowing snow, you probably want to be out there before the school bus. So you need to have that in your rules for when people actually work. What's overtime? How many days a week? So we'll just start with the question. The most common we've seen around the state are your winter or summer hours. So some people are the same all year. Some switch to a 4-day cycle. I say the summer, but that can be as much as 6 months. Some people do shift work during the winter. Some agencies can't. Some get it modified but set by the superintendent, and they actually adjust it, sometimes even during a particular week. Maybe they're out paving. And then, of course, you could do some other policy, but by far, the most common four are the ones we see here. I would say, if I had to say the most common in New York State, at the town level and county level, it's 4 days in the summer. Shifts winter is something you see a lot in larger communities. But again, you can see there's a lot of variety. If you borrow a policy from someone else to start, if you download that Preble policy, which is, as I say, I'm a big fan of borrowing from others, make sure you read through and check, because if they've written a 4-day week and you're not using it, make sure you change it and modify it. And anytime, if you've got none of the above, if you've got a different idea, we'll throw it in for the next time we do this to give people other ideas, because we love to share good ideas. So throw that in the Q&A for those who did the none of the above. Now, you can have a probationary status. This is not something that every agency has. Some agencies have this, some do not. And the idea is you hire somebody into a position and they're probationary. And those time frames for probationary can vary wildly. The idea is you have somebody into a position and you want to make sure they're actually doing the work. Okay? Now, in some cases, once you put them in, they're in. Uh, an appointed highway official at the county level, once they're appointed, they're in for 4 years. Okay? That's the way it is. But others have a time frame for that. So let's see what you've got for probationary periods, and let's talk about that just a little bit. So what would you choose? Not in this case, it's what you would choose, not what's in your policy. What would you choose if you could choose a probationary period? Okay? So if you want to rechange that, you're welcome to. What would you actually choose? Okay? And yes, you can point to the civil service probationary period if it's a civil service appointment. Okay? You can use that as part of it. And in that particular case, do you need to put that in your personnel policy? No, you could actually put in the personnel policy that says our probationary period for civil service positions is based upon the civil service probationary period. That way, if they change it, you don't have to change your policy. I like to do that if I can. And so most of you would do 6 months or 12 months or have 6 months or 12-month appointments. And again, the reason you want to do that is know someone can do the work. And the reason we see 6 and 12 are the most common is to get through at least a full season. So you can see how they're working out in the winter, how they're working out in the summer. Some agencies have as long as 2 years, okay? And some agencies reset that probationary period even when you give a promotion. So these are things you need to think about. But again, what is your agency going to have? Depends a lot on your duties and your size of your department. Now, in your employee handbook, if it's not negotiated, you're going to have a list of your wages, okay? You do not put down individual people's wages, okay? Unless it's required, you don't want to put out individual wages. What you want to put are ranges in there. So if someone knows, oh, we're going to hire in this range, and there might be reasons for differences, they might all be the same if it's negotiated. But, who sets the raises in your community? Is it set by contract, by the board, a board with the superintendent talking with each other, just by the superintendent, which is very rare. I don't think I've seen any of those lately. You just essentially only do cost of living. And then if you do put none of the above, please, again, throw that into Q&A, type that in, what you're doing in terms of who sets the raises. Obviously, this needs to be an employee handbook or in the contract because people want to know what they're going to be making and how much they're going to be making. And we'll talk about promotions and stuff here in a little bit. But keep that in mind. Those are going to control a lot of what you do. And a lot of people go, well, raises, I can't set the wages because they're set by contract or they're set by the board. That may be true, but you at least need to know what you've got, okay? I've got, by the way, in the Q&A there, someone mentioned the idea that you might want to cut somebody who doesn't meet the probationary status sooner. In other words, don't wait to the very end of the probationary period. Well, yes, that's absolutely true for probationary period employees. If they're not working out, don't keep going, well, we can see if they get better. If you know they're not working out, they're not working out. You don't have to wait until the end of the probationary period. If you think it's more just a matter of they're just not learning the culture or they're not learning certain things, you can give them a try. But remember, once they cross that probationary period line, it can be much more challenging to let them go. Okay. I don't know what the other none of the above is, so I can't really comment on it. Inside of that raise issue, remember, you've also got the issue of overtime. And that overtime also includes things such as call-outs. What's the minimum length of the call-out? Do they work nights? Do they work weekends? Do they have to be available? So raise your hand if your staff need to be available for coming in the winter, and it's actually something you have either agreed to in a policy or it's in the contract. Raise your hand. Okay, so a few of you have marked that down. You need to put that kind of thing in writing. That's absolutely important because what you're telling somebody is you have to be ready to come in. And maybe it's Friday night and they want to enjoy themselves and imbibe on something, which is perfectly legal. But now we've got the conflict that we want them to come in if there is a snow event, or we need to come in the case of an emergency. So you need to have that written down, and you may need to compensate folks for that. Okay. And in some contracts, it is negotiated and it's out there. And there might be a minimum length that you go out for a minimum of 3 or 4 hours. Again, anything that's related to money, you probably need to have that in writing, but don't restrict yourself if you can avoid it. The one thing absolutely I would put in your system is put in a system in place that essentially says if someone is not able to work for whatever reason, illness, they're under the influence of something, they have a family emergency, you gotta have a way to deal with that that's fair to everybody. You don't want to penalize someone who didn't expect an emergency and so they've gone out and had a good time. At the same time, if they know a snow event's coming, you need to have a way to make sure you have the staff available to deal with the snow event. And that's a challenging one, I can tell you right now. Okay, and if we had a whole day, we could spend quite a bit of time talking about some of those issues. Now, you need to know your list of holidays, okay? And there are lots of different holidays. So let's see what holidays you give out. What holidays do you give? Let's see. Let's see what holidays you give. I think there's 13 federal holidays right now. You get New Year's, yep, Christmas, okay. 4th of July, MLK Day, Juneteenth, Labor Day, which is coming up on Monday, okay. President's Day, which is officially at the federal level is still called Washington's birthday, by the way, if you're wondering, okay. There's at least 3 or 4 more I'm looking for here. Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, yep. Memorial Day, yep, okay. The key here is you need to put these things down in writing. Again, there's one I see that this is not a common one, and that's getting the day off to vote, voting day. Columbus Day. These are all different holidays that some people get. If you put it in writing that you list the actual holidays and something changes at the state or federal level, you still follow what's in writing. If, on the other hand, you said we get all federal and state holidays, and there's a new federal holiday, Juneteenth being the most recent, or there's a new state holiday, Chinese New Year, guess what? Your employees would get those days off. And so again, you need to think about how you want to organize what you get for holidays. Which is better? We're just telling you what you can set up. We really think it's really important to talk with and work with your compadres, with your employees, with your peers in the area, and have a consistent program. Okay? And let's see, did we get them all? I think we got most of them. I didn't see a few. Some people do give Good Friday off. Some don't. Some give some different holidays, some Jewish holidays in some areas, Chinese New Year's in some places. Again, just think about what you're going to have for holidays and realize, again, if you need to work on that, do you get paid for that and how much? Is it double time, triple time? Those are things you got to think about because there's an economic cost to them. Now, in terms of leave beyond holidays, okay, and different agencies do it in different ways. Some people do it with just combined a whole set of leave. Some people have sick leave separate from holidays, separate from vacation. Some people have just call it personnel leave, okay? Um, do you have flexible programs where they can put into a pool And then, of course, what happens in the case of emergency and bereavement. Now, we could go and make a list of all these things, and you can build up time. You can do it by the hour, by the day, whatever. But just in general, let's just see. Think about it, and including holidays. Just give yourself a second. Take 15, 20 seconds. We got time. How many total days of leave do most employees get? Greater than 30, 21 to 30, 16 to 20, 10 to 15, or less than 10, if you include holidays. Okay? Now, I can tell you, I bet most of you probably have a sliding scale with the number of days off. You get more days off after a while. That's not everybody, but some agencies do that. We certainly could do that here at Cornell. Some employees get more the longer they work here. Some employees, like myself, my number of days I get off was fixed the day I started and has never changed and never will. Again, different employees are treated differently for different reasons. Not good nor bad. Okay. So if you think about it, by far the most common we see around New York State is D, 21 to 30 days, if you count holidays in as well. And because if you think about it, you get about 2 weeks of vacation, 2 to 3 weeks. You add in 10 to 15 holidays. It's in that 21 to 30 range for most people, though a lot do cross over into the greater than 30 range. Okay? Now, there's a cost to those things, but at the same time, if you don't give people some time off, they might go somewhere else because wages alone aren't enough. Holidays and benefits make a big difference. And let's talk about one of the most common benefits, and that is personal protective equipment. Now, one of the most common ones we see in the highway community, and actually anything in the construction community, is safety shoes. So rather than providing the shoes, they provide a stipend, a fixed amount of money. So raise your hand if your agency does that. So for safety shoes only, you give people a stipend so they can buy their own safety shoes, but if it wears out, they have to buy new safety shoes. Okay? That is the most common we see, and that's usually negotiated if you have a union contract. Surprisingly less than I expected. We're in there. Okay, so let me ask you this. For those of you who do the stipend, do you have written in the policy how you know the shoe is no longer valid and making sure it's been updated and in good shape? You know, if it gets a hole in it, you still want people to use it? Think about that. Do you have a policy in place for what happens if? Again, don't put it in writing if you don't need to, but think about, do you need to have it? Now, what other PPE is provided? If you needed PPE, what other PPE is provided? Personal protective equipment by your department. Safety vest, yeah. Gloves, glasses, raincoats, okay. Hard hats, jackets, earplugs or ear muffs, depending. Yep. Remember, if it is something you require to do the job, you have to find a way to make sure people have it, either by putting it in writing or providing a stipend. Most personal protective equipment is done where it's provided by the employer, but that also means you need to have a way to make sure that it's not abused. And are they allowed to use it off the job? And that's something we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about equipment and tools, but keep that in mind. What are you providing? And while you want to put that in writing to some extent, you also want to make sure you think about it from a budgetary standpoint. How often do you go through these things? How often do you replace the helmet? Do you provide things like sunscreen or not? Okay? So think about what you need to do the job, and then what are you going to provide in terms of personal protective equipment? You need to have insurance in there. Insurance covers all kinds of things. We do not want to see someone in a wheelchair that's not just doing it as part of an exercise like Bernie was doing here, the big cheese. But that needs to be in there. And again, you might have a separate policy for the insurance, but what kind of health insurance do you have? You should be able to click on all of these. It was working, but sometimes I lose the technology battle. But do you just have general health insurance? Do you have optical? And the percentages will get just percentage based. That's one of these weird quirks of this Poll Everywhere tool. But you should be able to click on all of them, but it still shows just the total percentage. I don't know why it does it that way, but at least I can get a sense. So obviously general health, a lot of people have optical, some have dental, some have long-term medical. You might have other items that are included, everything from gym memberships to uh, you can even have in there wellness programs that are included as part of this. Here's the thing. A, if it's whether it's negotiated or not, do you like your plan? Do you think it has good choices? Do you have enough doctors? These are things that may be out of your control, but may make a huge difference to somebody. Let's say you had an employee who was going out on maternity leave. How much leave time do they get? But also, do they have good choices for doctors? Do they have good hospitals in the area? This can make a huge difference in terms of recruiting and retaining and keeping employees. So the quality of your health insurance is a benefit, and we need to make sure people are aware of that. Young people coming in might go, I don't need health insurance. We have to make them understand why health insurance is important, and you never know what's going to happen. So keep that in mind too. That's a really important item, and it probably needs to be in writing. And again, whether it's part of the health insurance, part of the employee manual or not, that's okay. We can talk about that as well. Now, this is one, and I bring this one up because this is something that creates issues. We'll just say it that way. So raise your hand. I'm not going to ask if you're doing it. I'm just going to ask if you know some agency in your area who allows employees to use the equipment or the vehicles that are at work for personal use. And that includes tools, that includes, the space even to work in the building over the weekend or something like that. Raise your hand if you know of somebody, not if you're doing it yourself. I don't want anybody thinking, oh, they're doing something. But if you know somebody who's doing this. And then while you're thinking about it, in the Q&A for me, somebody put in there if you think this is a good or a bad idea and why. Throw in the Q&A if you think that's a good idea or a bad idea and why. Let's see what we get. And I'll read back, modified slightly, what you say. Yeah, you think it's a bad idea, but why is it a bad idea? There's two or three reasons it's a bad idea. Or at least it's risky. I mean, the argument people will make, and I will tell you, is, oh, well, but that equipment's there anyway. If it's not being used, it's a waste. There's liability, there's insurance, okay? Somebody put one of the more critical ones. It's a resource, and if you're working in a government agency, it's not a private resource, it's a public resource. And if someone's using it in a private setting for their own use, that becomes a gift item, okay? And yes, it's a perception item. We know of agencies who have it in their contract that the employees are allowed to do these things. The liability risk is high, the perception is an issue, and the biggest concern I've got, actually in my mind, is what happens if they break something, themselves or the piece of equipment. Let's say you allow them to use the tools and they break a screwdriver or they break a socket head or they damage something. How do you know and get it back to its original condition? So think about that. Even if you think, oh, that's okay, how do you make sure you don't create a situation where it doesn't get replaced because someone is using it on their private own time? Okay. So keep that in mind. I mean, here, the local roads program, we own, I think it's two, it might be three hand levels that we show in class and we use now and then. I have one of my own that I use if I need to on my own property, um, for that very reason, because, well, I want to make sure that there isn't a risk if somehow I broke it, that I would replace it. But do you need to put that in writing? Common sense says no, but you might need to in any case. Now, in terms of licensing, I'm talking about this is a good one. Do any highway crews stop at the supermarket for a break, and use the same vehicle, use the fleet vehicle to do that? Now, that's a great question. I'll just get y'all to raise your hand. How many of you allow somebody to stop at the convenience store to pick something up with the vehicle? Again, perception, reality. That might be okay, but again, do you need to have that in writing? Do you need to have a policy for when that's allowed and how far out of the way is it okay? Because perception is reality. But make sure you understand that you don't give out a gift to somebody. You're giving them a benefit, and they might get taxed on that. There might be a tax implication if you're using a vehicle and you've assigned it to somebody. Make sure you understand the IRS taxing for the use of anything that you do assign to somebody. So licensing. Now I'm talking licensing in this case, licensings that are required to do the job. Odd licenses might be something like a crane operator's license or something of that ilk, but much more commonly it's a commercial driver's license. Okay? And of course there are, and I say new CDL requirements have actually been around now for over half a decade, but how are you handling the new CDL requirements? What are you doing about both keeping, retaining, and bringing people up who don't have CDLs into CDL positions? What are you doing to handle these new requirements? You're doing some training. Okay, good. Training is key. We're big fans of training. We're going to actually talk about training here right before we end. You can do it on the employees, and it actually becomes a benefit to them. And again, these are things you might want to put into your employee policy that says, hey, we'll help you get a CDL. In return, here's what we ask of you. And you can put that down so everybody's on the same page. And it has been negotiated in some cases. And again, some people say they'll pay the first 500 or half the cost or something of that ilk. Some people are doing the training themselves internally. Some people have to keep working for a number of years to quote unquote pay the money back. There are tons of ideas. We actually put out a document that talks about what we found counties are doing. And when I say counties, I'm not talking about the county highway departments. I'm talking about within given counties, what people are doing at the town, county, village, and city level to get their CDL licenses. Some have pretty robust programs. Some are struggling. Some use BOCES. But these are all kinds of things you need to think about possibly putting into your employee handbook because you want to make sure you have CDL drivers that can do the job. And do they need endorsements? Do they need to have additional licenses to make everybody safe? And there are differences, by the way, if they're only driving in New York State or they're driving for commercial work. And yes, some people are registered for training facilities. They're all balances. Now, in terms of one thing that absolutely needs to be in a good employee handbook or negotiated, and that's your grievance and discipline procedure. Um, most people have what we call progressive discipline, which means you start with an oral warning, but you do document it in writing. So it's a bit of a misnomer, but what that means is you talk to someone and then you document it versus a written warning, which you actually provide them a written warning and you document it. And then you start progressively suspension, times off, and maybe even to the point of actually a disciplinary firing hearing. But the key is when it comes to your program is you want to have a consistent procedure in place. And it should be fair to everybody and it should be pretty transparent. And more importantly, what kind of things require to have a discipline procedure? What things are you going to be in there? Okay? And there's a great thing in the Q&A that I'll talk about as you're putting in examples of things requiring discipline. And that is, as I said earlier, I'm thinking of the employee handbook as a single document, but it may be multiple documents that have really just all been compiled together over time. Because you might have a union contract, you might have a purchasing policy, which we'll talk about in just a minute. You might have a separate uh, agreement in terms of PPE, things like that. And they're all combined, your employee handbook, your employee policies. I mean, Cornell's policies are all series of different policies. They're all collectively an employee handbook. And again, you're trying to make sure you have consistency and you don't create a problem where you create a conflict with one versus the other, and then which one might control. Okay? So again, we see on the list of things requiring discipline: insubordination, cell phone use, tardiness, telecommuting, late to work. All of these things, don't put it in writing unless you need to, but make sure you have a plan in place if you do, and be consistent to everybody. You know, not showing up for 5 minutes late every single day, is that worse than not showing up at all? Okay, depends on the job. Some jobs it'd actually be worse to show up 5 minutes late. How soon do they have to communicate? What's an excused absence? What's a non-excused absence? When do you catch people, if you catch people using drugs or alcohol? How do you test for that? Okay, these are all issues that come into play. You're also going to need to make sure you have a good ethics policy. Um, Everyone is supposed to have an ethics policy by state law, but let's just see. Do you have an ethics policy? And again, it may be separate, but it's still part of your overall employee handbook or policies. And do you have an ethics policy? Yes, no, not sure, we should, none of the above. Everybody says yes. That's good. Again, you're supposed to. When I've asked this, sometimes private people will say no, but they're supposed to if they're an incorporation in New York State. Okay. But what do you include in the ethics policy? Do you include things like foreign transactions? Probably not for most local agencies, but what do you need to have in there? And the main thing with most ethics policies is there needs to be consistency, transparency, and some enforcement mechanism. You cannot truly legislate out ethics, but you need to have a way to enforce it and make sure people are aware of those issues. In terms of drug and alcohol testing, which you brought up in the grievance procedures, um, these are important considerations, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that in our last 10 minutes and a couple of other things. But this is one that's a big challenge because it's a legal drug now. How's your department handling the marijuana issue? What do you do about marijuana? Not allowed. But how do you test for it then? How do you know? And by the way, it's still not allowed if you're a CDL driver. Drug testing, okay? So you drug test them. So, but there's no simple test. Yeah, you'd have to do it. It's not okay. So again, these are things you have to think about. And because of the CDL, it gets relatively easy for an agency that does a lot of CDL work to say, hey, nobody. And we're just going to be consistent. Because anybody who's doing what's called a safety sensitive function has to be part of your drug testing program. Okay? Now, what that is something you can actually think about. But what do you currently list for safety sensitive functions in your department? What kind of things would you put down that says, yep, you're part of the drug testing program? Obviously, CDL operators. Number one, that's easy. It's automatic. You have to include them. Anybody with a CDL. But are there people who don't have a CDL who probably should be in the pool? Are there people without a CDL that you would still list as safety sensitive? Confined space work might be something to think about. Yeah, even though they're only a laborer, if they're doing confined space work, you might want to think about including them in the pool. But again, there's something you might need to put in the employee handbook or negotiate if you have a contract. Okay? So the CDL is the easy one. It's the non-CDL people you have to decide about. And if you've got 30 employees, 20 of them have CDLs, 5 of them are doing work that's of a safety sensitive nature. Maybe you got a welder who doesn't have a CDL, but welding would be listed as a safety sensitive function. And you're down to only 2 or 3 or maybe 4 employees. What about maybe including everybody? There's a cost, but there's also a fairness issue. There's a balance between these things. And by the way, the highway superintendent, are they required to have a CDL or not? And even if they don't, are what they're doing safety sensitive? Should they be included in the pool? It's just, again, something you need to think about to be consistent with everything you've got. Now, some agencies have light duty. I'll let you answer the question on do you have light duty as we're going here. And you can have light duty for all your positions, some positions, no light duty, case by case basis, or none of the above. And the idea is someone is hurt, they broke a leg, they've sprained something. Can they do light duty work? Do you have anything? And no is not an uncommon thing that we see. Yes, for some positions. Yes, for all positions are also not uncommon by any stretch. Um, the challenge with the case by case idea is what happens when something occurs. How do you treat somebody consistently? On the other hand, if you don't have a case by case and somebody falls through the cracks, what do you do in that case? So again, this is a case where having a policy can really help you out. So everybody knows up front, what are the rules in terms of light duty? What can you allow? What can you not allow? Because if somebody gets hurt when they're on light duty, now you create another can of worms if you don't have something in writing. In your handbook, do you have promotions? That's pretty important to have it listed. When do you give promotions? How do you give them? Do you not do them at all? Some agencies actually have policies where they don't do any promotions internally. They do everything via outside hiring. But how do you give promotions in your particular agency? How do you give promotions? And it's okay to say we just don't. You do it per the contract, okay? Could be time of service. It could be exam based, especially if you're still using civil service. You could have to have everybody has to apply. You could do merit ones. Um, You could do it based on performance. You could say if you do X, Y, and Z, you can apply or you'll get one automatically. I've seen both. Which method works is the one that works for your agency, but try to remember to think about everybody. And again, there's an example. All DPW employees have the same title. In that case, there is no promotion system. Think about that from the standpoint of keeping people. Can actually be good, it can be bad to have that situation. Okay, and some people, all promotions have to be applied for. These are things you probably need to think about, at least think about putting them in the employee handbook. But again, you don't always have to do that in every single case. Now, this is something everybody has a purchasing policy. Whether it's part of your employee handbook or not is a good question, but as a minimum, they should know there's a purchasing policy available and they should know where it is if you're not going to put it as part of the handbook. And I'm okay with keeping them separate. I understand why you do that. But do you know your purchasing policy? And if I was to ask your employees, would they be able to answer the same? So when they can go and purchase things, when they have to go get quotes, what happens if a piece of equipment breaks down and you need to go buy $15 worth of parts to get it working again? You know, those are important things to understand so we don't create problems for us later on. And then, of course, we need to make sure everybody is trained. We are a training organization. Um, we can do all kinds of different things for training. You know, how do you train yourself and your crew? How do you make sure you're learning? Now, you're obviously here. Thank you for coming today. But these are questions we should think about. And you can actually tie promotions and training together. We know agencies that do that. Say that if you do a certain amount of training, you're now eligible for a promotion. If you don't do the training, you're not eligible for promotion, but you can do it in person, you can do it virtually, you can do hands-on. There are lots of ways to train. And again, if we had 2 hours, we could spend a whole bunch of time, but I'll show you the most common ones we see going around the state. Obviously, we can train people via books, videos, DVDs, but online training is becoming more and more common. Simulators, if you're not available in your area, think about it. A lot of your insurance carriers have access. Some of the unions do. Classroom training. Thing I like about classroom training is it puts people in the same room to talk to each other. On the job, of course, in-house, tailgate talks. We have over 100 tailgate talks if you want to train people using that. And you can even do an equipment rodeo. And my last question for you, just because I'm curious, raise your hand if you still do equipment rodeos. Raise your hand if you do an equipment rodeo. And I don't care if it's a summer equipment rodeo or a winter equipment rodeo. I'm a big fan of them. I wish we did them more. Not only does it train people, but it creates a sense of camaraderie, especially with large pieces of equipment. Better to knock down a cone than knock down a mailbox, and better than knocking down a person. Okay? So whatever you're doing for your handbook, let's remember again, back to the beginning, the KISS system. Okay? And yes, this was at a local cooperative extension. And it says, please do not flush the following: sanitary napkins, paper towels, phone bills, goldfish, or your hopes and dreams. The idea is we want to keep things simple and we want to work together because we all have a job to do to help the public on the roads to keep everybody safe and get home. Now, we have one more webinar coming up in a couple of weeks. And like the bear, getting ready for winter is sooner than you think. He was scratching his back, by the way. Uh, so with that, we are just about right on time. So I thank you very much. And we'll stay open here for about 15, 20 seconds to see if you have any questions that you want to ask about employee handbooks. And if not, everybody have a great weekend for the Labor Day weekend. You get a couple of days off. Again, a holiday coming up. Hopefully the weather will stay good. It looks like a little warmer and pretty good weather. And I thank you very much. We'll see you in snow and ice in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.